tell us about who the book was targeted towards. Is this something for people who grew up with that era and can reminisce, or is it something a tournament player today can find useful and benefit them in making them a better player?
I think, well, when we decided to make the deck, I mean, the book, what I was thinking more than anything was, I want this out there, right? I wasn't thinking marketing-wise in terms of who am I going to sell this to. That's kind of a question I didn't even ask in the sense, because we're going to make this presentation and I know this is valuable and the right people will find it. But in terms of who it's for, I certainly think the old-timers get a kick out of it. I got a kick out of reading all fours and stuff. I get a kick out of reading my own stuff just because you get it in nice form, you get to look back on it and remember and think about it. And you also you often learn there's new insights there. But I really think that knowing your history, knowing the history of the game, of decks, of concepts, people, but also just reading really interesting strategic thought and understanding how to think about Magic is insanely valuable. And I think that you really learn which stuff stands the test of time when you try to say, okay, can someone step in and really read this and really learn from this, even if this format is completely irrelevant to them. It's hard for me to tell exactly which parts of it are easiest for someone who doesn't know about the formats and who is potentially sitting there with Gatherer looking up half the cards because they're that old. But I really think a lot of the articles really speak to a lot of that. Like, you learn a lot about like how the deck design process that I use, and I still use it. And we saw this weekend it's still very successful. And you see the development of that. You see how to think about matchups. You see how to think about like what's important in the game. And if you can look past the details to think about why these details are the way they are and like what's the thought behind it, I think you can learn a ton. And I mean, I don't actually catch up with today's writers as much as I might like, or as much as I don't want to pass judgment on them, but it seems like there's been much more of an emphasis on the now recently. And
when you say recently, how recent do you
like
mean?
Last few years, after I stopped for the most part, we were under tremendous pressure at everywhere I ever wrote once the money started coming in, especially at Brainburst, but also at other places, although it was much better afterwards and before. And the pressure was, people do not want to know how to fish. They want the fish. And they want it served in 20 minutes or less, and they want it on a bun. They do not want fine dining. They want a deck list. They want what cards come in, what cards come out. They want specific instructions on what to do in situations, but even that is pushing it. They basically do not want to become better Magic players, right? The dojo started with the slogan, study and grow strong. And a lot of what was written back then was engineered towards making people better, towards understanding the thought process. When I read something back then, I was trying to make myself better. So I wanted to know the why. I wanted to know what made something tick on a fundamental level. And that's how we got good. Now, I feel like a lot of people will share insight into, here's the deck, here's how it works, here's how you play it, which is not at all unhelpful, but is much less good in the long run. Whereas before, like whenever I would talk about a deck, I would start by talking about how I built it. Not the cards I chose, but here was the thinking process. That also makes it, I mean, I started that partly because it makes it easier to write it, because you sort of go through the history in your mind, and then you're in the right mode, and you've covered all the bases. But in a real way, if you don't understand how the deck got made, it makes it much harder to understand why the deck is the way it is. And more importantly, it makes it much harder for you to actually build the deck yourself. So, if I write about this tournament, I'm going to go back to that, and I'm going to say, I built one deck, and once I turned it in, we were, I believe, 4 cards off main deck from that first list before I played a game. I played it in this Pro Tour. Because I managed to know from my past history exactly how this deck was going to work. One of the cards I simply wasn't aware of. The other 3, I was aware that was a possibility. So the Senji I didn't know existed. Basically, I just didn't realize. That was just an easy swap. And then the Bailoffs and the Thornling weren't in the original build. Those slots originally were the 4th Finest Hour, the 4th Rafik, and an Admonition Angel. but that's a very small change. And I did that because I understand so much about the theory behind how that actually works, and I got that by articulating it and reading it from other people. And now, but like every time you do that, like people, you can tell people are often skipping over that preamble. You can tell a lot of people are like, just get to the list already. Yeah. So you put the list at the point where you got to the habit of story that some people will want to know, either because they just want to read it because they find it interesting, or because they want to try and learn. Then you've got deck list. After the deck list in the article will generally come instructions for people who just want to play. Right? And then that's useful for them. It's not unuseful for the other people. It holds together. You very much got people who are reading part 1 and part 2, and then people who are reading part 2, just like if you have a serialized drama, you would say previously on, and then you summarize exactly what you need to know here, which is the deck list, and then get on with it. And both people can follow along, and they have different experiences.
Sure.
So.
To summarize for those who just want the fish at home,
right?
If I said, I'm a PTQ player who wants to be successful on the Pro Tour,
right,
would you say, you should buy my book, it will help you do that?
Yes, you should buy my book, it will help you do that.
And not just because you get a portion of the money.
Believe me, I don't care. Like, I get much more of a kick out of the fact that you bought my book and you're reading my book than I get out of your cash. I do not need this money. It's very small money. But I do want to get the book out there. I do like the idea of people reading. I want people to learn from this. I feel that sort of, to get really good, you really want to understand the process. You really want to understand what's going on behind the decisions you're making. And that's the kind of thing you want to focus on. And this will help you do that. And this will help you dial in. And also, just having this background and having this knowledge will really help you converse with the old-timers as well. Which sounds like a silly reason, but a lot of those old-timers are really good, and they still show up reasonably often. And being able to work with them and talk to them and network with them, much more valuable than you think. And also, they're just good times. So there's that. But I really think this is the type of thing, like my writing, a lot of people will tell me this, made a lot of people better. A lot of people better at Magic and better at deck building. It's less useful if you have decided you will never build a deck in your life. But that's a huge mistake. Because when you do that, you end up going around, trying to get someone to give you a deck list, you don't know what's going on. You don't understand why the decisions are being made, and then you're sideboarding, and suddenly you realize, I am building a deck. I'm building it right now, and I have 2 minutes. And they do it wrong.
Well, let's kind of wrap up with discussion of future products. You've kind of been referencing a My Files 2 type thing.
Right.
Is that something you're interested in doing? And what would it contain? New
material?
Well,
that's done. Right. That's a done deal. That's a lock. My Files Part 1 is Part 1 because the book was too big. Like if you put everything together, it's just too big to publish in that form. It makes sense to split it. So Part 1 is up through there. Part 2 is essentially all of the other stuff up through when I stopped that we have rights to. We, I believe, don't have rights to the MagicTheGathering.com stuff because they insisted, because once they were owned by Hasbro, we couldn't start modifying contracts. I couldn't get the rights. If I could get the rights, they would be included because I think they're great. But unfortunately, I don't think we have them. So we're going to have those 2 parts. And then there's the open question of 3. We're debating various options for that, but 3 would be, we're cutting out the set reviews, at least after the first few, which are kind of a little bit different from the books. And those together are another monster volume, if you were to do them. / potentially we could convince people to give us the rights to the few we don't have, or find the few lost articles. I believe some of the stuff from the New Wave stuff, I believe, is lost. We can't find it. So if we could find it, that would be great. But the computers, that's 3 computers ago, I definitely don't have any copies. And also just new material. Like if we succeed here, then it tells us there's a market for this sort of thing. We can start doing like potentially relatively timeless stuff about how you build decks, how you draft, how you play, how you think on a basic level and on a complex level, but thinking abstractly, not thinking about specific formats necessarily except as examples.